One of Nietzsche's last books is entitled The Antichrist. This is clearly Nietzsche at his most polemical. It is Nietzsche trying to provoke or really demand a response. It's a bit of PR. The truth, of course, is that Nietzsche was no Antichrist, despite what I've heard from a few friends in North Texas. And Nietzsche was not so vehemently anti-everything Christian as he sometimes appears. We've already suggested, for example, that he has nothing bad to say about Jesus himself. And what he attacks in Christianity has to even be modified by an appreciation of how much he derives from it, the ways in which he appreciates it, how important he thinks it's been in history, and so on. But Antichrist is certainly a word which is going to get people's attention. So too, in his moral works, which span pretty much all of the works from the middle experimental period till just about the last year. The moral works, he enjoys calling himself an immoralist. And one could misunderstand that in much the same way. It's also an attempt to shock, an attempt to provoke condemnation, but at least an attempt to get people to read him and pay attention. The truth is that by any ordinary standard, Nietzsche is no immoralist. He was, by all accounts, including, for example, a very beautiful account we have of him from Lou Salome. He was a very kind and gentle person. As we've commented earlier, his last healthy act on the brink of insanity was he hugged a horse out of compassion to save it from a beating. Nietzsche was, by all accounts, to use a word he would absolutely loathe, a nice man. And he was the last person one would think of in terms of the images that he often provokes. But immoralism, and being an immoralist, is again a good way of attracting attention and a good way of indicating some severe break with the tradition in which he was raised, some severe break with Judeo-Christian morality, again with a capital M as I put it in last lecture, and a severe break with the kinds of values that that tradition represents. The truth is, as he wrote in one of his letters, that his own morality was actually more severe than the morality he found around him. The truth is that, like Kierkegaard, his near contemporary, there was a sense in which his criticism of the Christians that surrounded him was that for all their piousness and self-righteousness, their morals were in fact much more lax. They did not engage in self-discipline. They did not pursue their passions in such a way that it required a real devotion as opposed to giving lip service to the doctrines which they supposedly believed. What I argued in the last lecture was that what Nietzsche rejects is not morality as such, that is, morality with a small m. Morality is simply a system of values that any person, people, or species really must have to survive. But what he rejects is a certain conception of morality, I said morality with a capital M, according to which morality is something singular. It is something universal. It is something which admits of no exceptions. And what goes with this is any system of divine commandments, which are simply imposed upon us. But again, let's be very clear. Nietzsche did not kill, he did not steal, he did not commit adultery, he had nothing but honor for his father, long dead, and his mother, who lived until he was actually just 4 years away from death himself. He, in fact, obeyed all the 10 Commandments, if obedience here can be conceived of as acting in conformity with, but what he rejected was the status, the nature of those commandments as such, as God-given, as something which were imposed upon him. Not killing is simply an expression of one's own nature. Not killing is an expression of the fact that one has more interesting and important things to do with one's life than hurt other people. Not stealing isn't a function of being prohibited from doing something. Not stealing is a matter, we would say, of one's own personal integrity. There's something greedy, there's something grubby about stealing. And so Nietzsche would have condemned it, but not because it's against the moral law, but because someone who steals is someone who is despicable, somebody who's pathetic. And so too with the other commandments. Kathy and I were talking just the other day, and we were talking about how everyone has a certain amount of respect and love for their parents. And then we, of course, thought for a moment, and the friend that was with us said, well, maybe not. But we all got into a conversation and said, well, you know, if someone doesn't respect and love their parents, then that's really their problem. And interestingly enough, this other fellow was a minister, but it wasn't immediately appealed to breaking a divine commandment. It was rather appealed, as Nietzsche would have insisted it must be appealed, to a personal flaw, something about a person which is detrimental to life. After all, if you don't love and respect your parents, whoever they are, the problem is that there's an important piece of your life, an important piece of your history, which has somehow gone awry. So the idea is that Nietzsche rejects the Ten Commandments, and he rejects the whole story in which the Ten Commandments are embedded. But it's very important to say, he doesn't reject what you might call the content of the commandments. What he does is he wants to look at them in a different way. Look at them as something that is personal, something that is instinctual, something that is natural. And then, of course, one has a problem when one has to come and try to explain how some people can be so bad, how some people can break the commandments so consistently. But that becomes a psychological, sociological question. It can't simply be relegated to the realm of some people are evil. That doesn't explain anything. So too, with Kant. It's not that Nietzsche rejected anything like rational principles, and he didn't reject reason as such, as we suggested in earlier lectures. But what he rejects is a certain notion of rationality and a certain notion of morality, which, as he points out over and over again, is a kind of rationalization. And thinking about Kant once again, I think we can see how this works. What Kant does, in a very simple, deft move which permeates his ethics, is he separates what he calls the inclinations, passions, emotions, desires, and the like, from reason, practical reason, the realm of morality. Well, once you do that, and once you've said, when you're ascertaining a person's moral worth, what you look at is the extent to which they do or do not act on the basis of the moral law itself. What you're doing is sort of pushing out of view the inclinations and saying, in effect, those aren't what matter, and we shouldn't bother looking at them. In a very early work, Kant, anticipating Schopenhauer, says that compassion, a sentiment, an emotion, is something which is very beautiful in people, but if we're doing serious morality, it's of no moral worth. To act towards someone on the basis of a feeling like compassion might be a very nice thing to do, but to be moral, you should act because of some principle, some rule, which you would universalize for everyone. Or, to use a different formulation that Kant sometimes gives, it's to treat other people as ends in themselves rather than means. But what that does is it hides or pushes aside the actual motives of our behavior. And it says, of all the possible motives of behavior, we're only going to interest ourselves in one particular kind of motivation, namely being motivated to do the rational thing, the moral thing. But as Kant himself famously says, although it's only in a couple of sentences, we're not in a position to know what all the motives of our behavior actually are. Freud comments when he is introducing his notion of the unconscious in one of his many series of introductory lectures. He says, the philosophers before me discovered the unconscious. I just basically made it scientific. One of the philosophers he was no doubt referring to was Kant and Schopenhauer and some of Schopenhauer's contemporaries, and before even Kant, Kant's kind of philosophical grandfather, the German philosopher Leibniz. But in each case, what you get is a picture in which motivation is somehow mysterious. There wasn't that sensibility in England, certainly wasn't that sensibility in France, but in Germany in particular, the unconscious runs all the way through. How interesting then, that when Kant comes to formulate an ethics, what he does is he uses the unconscious, although not with that title obviously, he uses the unconscious as a way of remaining oblivious to precisely the motivations that Nietzsche wants to root out and expose. So, as we've argued in earlier lectures, it may well be that a kindly action or an action on principle is in fact motivated by something very different. The urge to superiority, a kind of contempt, a kind of self-defense. Kant doesn't let us see that. And so what he gives us instead is a brilliant system of rationalizations. And so too, so much of morality and moral principles consists of just that, rationalizations. There's a philosopher I know, whom I won't name, who is, in his own opinion, an orthodox Kantian. He always acts on principle. And you know, it's a funny thing that these principles always come out to be in his advantage. Because the truth is that a principle of morality, while it in one sense might be conceived of as absolute, the application of the principle allows for all sorts of fiddling. And one of the most frequent refutations of Kant's theory of morality, something which is foisted on undergraduates very often in their first course. It was invented, I think, by Hegel, who was the first one I know to use it. But it was the following idea. If you have a principle, and you are not allowed to make exceptions, which Kant insists on, then to apply the principle, you certainly need some sense of exactly what that principle is in this particular situation. So, we have a very general rule that comes from the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. But now if you think about it, immediately we think of two exceptions. First, except in self-defense. We all acknowledge that it might be a bad thing to do, an undesirable thing to do, but whether it is justified, you can imagine the most horrendous attack scenario. You had no choice but to kill your attacker. And in that case, we would want to say, it's not wrong to kill. In this case, it's okay, or it's justified, or it's excused. Or in wartime. Now, without going into all the different arguments about the legitimacy of war and all of that, if you're a soldier on the front line, and what you are ordered to do is to kill the enemy, then one would have to say, well, that's what you're supposed to do, so in this case, that can't be what you ought not to do. And again, I'm ignoring pacifism, which I strongly endorse, but that's a different question. The point is that thou shalt not kill isn't as straightforward as it sounds. We want to add some qualifying phrases. Now, what keeps these qualifying phrases from counting as exceptions in Kant's sense? Well, what keeps them from being exceptions is the fact that it's still universal. Anyone, you, me, anyone else, should not kill except in self-defense, except in wartime. But of course, one can add more qualifying phrases. And if we were to think about it and use our ingenuity, we could probably do this at some length. There's a point at which, if you add enough qualifying phrases, what you get is a class, if you like, a class in which it universally applies, but a class which is so narrowly defined that it really includes just one. And in that case, you can act on a universal principle. You just happen to be the only member of the class to whom the principle applies. Now, this is getting kind of abstract, but let me make the point. The point is that if you have an abstract moral principle, the application of that principle, in fact, is going to require some gerrymandering and fiddling to apply to the particular case. And once you've done that, what becomes apparent is that it functions as a rationalization. This is not always a vicious matter, but the important thing is that it's not simply the application of a rational principle, it is something else. And once again, one has to say, It operates in order to not have to look, as closely as Nietzsche insists that we look, on the actual motives behind our behavior. In the same temperament, he rejects the philosophy of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill's favorite ethics. He rejects utilitarianism, first, as I said, because the Germans in general found utilitarianism and its emphasis on utility and usefulness to be vulgar. But also, and I think more importantly for Nietzsche, he rejects it because it's a theory of the general good. And as we've seen so often, what Nietzsche insists is that a civilization, a culture, a society is not to be measured in terms of the general well-being of the people, but only, as he puts it in one of his early works, by its highest specimens. We think of ancient Greece, and we think in terms of the Trojan heroes, the Trojan and Greek heroes. We think in terms of the great artists, the great philosophers. We think in terms of the great statesmen. We don't think in terms of the hoi polloi. We may acknowledge that perhaps Greece was a better place to live than perhaps Persia at the time, or perhaps somewhere in North Africa. Maybe, maybe not. But that's not what makes a great civilization. And of course, what Nietzsche is always emphasizing is the greatness of a civilization in terms of its creative originality, in terms of its artistic productions. And to think in terms of utilitarianism, to think in terms of utility, to think in terms of the general welfare, ignores that element. Again, I think Nietzsche is being polemical. Nietzsche was as touched as anyone if he saw someone who was in bad straits on the street. Nietzsche, I'm sure, was as upset as we get when he heard about some tragedy in another country. Nevertheless, that's not the focus of ethics. In any case, it's not the focus of his ethics. The focus has to be on what produces excellence. The problem with morality, in other words, is that what it gives us is a leveling device. The problem with imposing the same rules on everyone is not just that it's unfair to some. Nietzsche wouldn't make much of that as such. But rather what it does is it lops off the tops, the peaks of excellence, and instead puts all its emphasis on the ordinary. To put this in one way, in Jane Austen, there is always one character. I'm thinking of Mr. Collins in Sense and Sensibility in particular. But he's a character who is very moral. And what's more, he is very reflectively, articulately moral. And everything he does for a reason. And the reason is a moral reason. And the moral reason typically takes the form of something like what Kant called a moral law. Unfortunately, while he obeys these laws, he's a complete bore. Inevitably, he is someone whom the heroine just wants to get rid of and certainly not marry. The problem is that if you follow this notion of morality, as you find it in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as you find it in Kant in particular, it is possible to be a good person, and I want to emphasize that banal phrase, a good person, just by not doing anything wrong. When you think about Christian confession, the question is not, what have you done that's wonderful this week? The question is, what have you done that's evil? What sins have you committed? And the sort of, I suppose, A+ in a confessional would be if you could go in and say, absolutely nothing. Of course, that might be a sin in itself because it represents some sort of pride, but never mind. The idea is that not doing anything wrong is what makes you a good person. And Nietzsche says, this is a good definition of the sickly. You could go through life and never do anything wrong. And one can imagine someone on his or her deathbed thinking, as Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich does on his deathbed, I don't understand. I did everything right. I didn't do anything wrong. And yet, why does it all feel so empty? Because the truth is, being a good person and leading a good life in just those terms really doesn't amount to living a life at all. Kierkegaard reserves the special word existence, from which we get the term existentialism, for just this notion of a life, underscored, italicized, and so on. It is the idea of vibrancy. It's the idea of an adventure. It's the idea of living with passion and devotion and commitment. And for Nietzsche, too, the ideal should not be just being a moral person, obeying these rules, not breaking these commandments. But the ideal is to really live. How should we understand this? Well, let me give you an analogy which I've been hinting towards for quite a few lectures. I think it's an important one, and precisely because it puts Nietzsche not so much on the outside of the entire Western tradition as some sort of grandstanding heckler, but rather brings him right back into the tradition, which I think is where he belongs. Very often, modern philosophy thinks of ethics in two basic flavors. There's the flavor that comes with Kant and this whole emphasis on rational principles, and there's the flavor that comes with John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism and this emphasis on the general good. Looking at it from some distance, you might say, they're really the same. I mean, the principles are different and the considerations are different. One focuses on the intentions with which one acts. The other focuses on the consequences of action. But the truth is they're both involved with rational principles. Categorical imperative or some variation of that on the one hand, and the principle of utility or some variation of that on the other. But it's still, in a way, two peas in a pod. There's an alternative. There's a different way of thinking about ethics, which doesn't come from some foreign source, although I would mark Confucius as one such advocate, but rather straight at the bottom of the Western tradition, and that is from the Greeks. Pagan morality, and you might say morality with a small m, because it's one kind of morality, there are others, as opposed to what is called morality with a capital M, what we take to be the only form of morality, which in fact turns out to be just another morality with a small m, the morality of a particular culture, of a particular tradition. And the contrast is dramatic, although again, the sort of person who would be heavily praised in, say, Aristotle's time might be very much like the person who was heavily praised in Kant's or Nietzsche's time, but again, the basis on which they would be praised tends to be very different. Because Kant's sense of morality puts so much emphasis on not doing what's wrong, in other words, coming up to a certain moral standard, there's a real problem trying to understand people who excel, people who are so far above that. In fact, Jesus himself presents Kant with a moral problem, because with Jesus, there is no battle, as there is in all of us, between what you ought to do and your personal desires. The sort of story of the temptation of Christ sort of in a way spells this out. That what we get is a picture of a person who is so perfect that these things aren't at war with one another. And if you take the idealized vision of Christ, which Kant certainly accepted, then there's a question of how does he rate morally? To say that he's a good person just seems kind of limp. It doesn't capture it. What do we do with people who are saints? Or differently, what do we do with people who are heroes? They might not fit the category of being a good person. Nevertheless, they very clearly deserve some kind of moral status. So Kant gives us the term, their behavior is supererogatory. I suppose we might say above and beyond the call of duty. And that's a nice category. But isn't it strange that it's a secondary category, a kind of add-on? What if a morality were to be considered primarily in terms of such notions? And that's what we get from the Greeks. The comparison with Aristotle here is one that Nietzsche himself did not make, and it's interesting to speculate why. I would say the primary reason, now in the realm of morality, is not so much that Aristotle was linked up with Plato and Socrates, whom Nietzsche said are decadent. Aristotle's a decadent too. But rather because, as Nietzsche knew Aristotle, he was probably hooked up in particular with Christianity, and with Thomas Aquinas, even more particularly. Aquinas basically Aquinas virtually took Aristotle's ethical philosophy, and much else besides, and brought it into the Christian religion. And so my guess is that when Nietzsche thought about Aristotle's ethics, what he thought of was primarily this association. In any case, he doesn't seem to pay any attention to it. But, as Nietzsche himself says, what Aristotle does give us is a set of virtues, a set of values, which are probably pretty accurate as a description, maybe not of the way Greece was in Aristotle's time, but at least the ideals that the Greeks of Aristotle's time thought were most important. It may have been that the instantiation, the realization of those ideals, came a generation or so earlier. But nevertheless, it gives us a picture of morality which is very different from the picture we get, for example, from Kant or from John Stuart Mill. The basic notion is the notion of excellence. Whereas you think about Kant in terms of a kind of reciprocity, Kant's often interpreted in terms of the golden rule, sort of formalized in a very fancy way. Always think in terms of what you'd like to have done to you to think about how you should treat other people. Or the vulgar ethics of the English utilitarians. Think about what this does for the general good. What the Greeks suggested, and Aristotle is most articulate on this, is that what ethics consists of are excellences. The Greek word arete can be translated one of two ways. In English translations of the ethics, it's typically translated as virtue. But a more accurate translation, I understand from my classics friends, is really the word excellence. So to think in terms of virtues is to think in what terms people can be excellent. Not just good, but excellent. And to be excellent is not just to obey the rules. It's not just not to do what's wrong. But to be excellent is to be exceptional. It's to be the best. And it's very clear in Nietzsche's conception of the Greeks and in Aristotle's description of his own generation, that what you get is a whole series of descriptions of the ideally good, or what Aristotle calls the great-souled man. This is the ideal, to be exceptional, not to be like everyone else, and hopefully to be a good person along with them. Kant's ideal. This notion of the virtues has many virtues itself. For one thing, it is, as Nietzsche would be the first to insist, individual. Even if, as in Aristotle, the virtues are defined in terms of their place in a very particular culture or society. The virtues are individual, and what they represent is something natural. In fact, Aristotle's whole philosophy is a philosophy in which the way of thinking about human beings and human behavior is to think of them as natural, to think of them as quasi-biological, and his leading question is, what is the nature of man? What is the function? What is her place in nature? And to think that way, of course, is just what Nietzsche is advocating by naturalism. One of my old teachers once said to me, this is in the course in Aristotle, that the only two thinkers he knows in the history of philosophy who were so wedded to biology and ethics together were Aristotle and Nietzsche. And it was a comment that stuck with me ever since, because what you get is exactly the picture of an ethics of excellence that Nietzsche really wants, and it's right in the middle of the Western tradition. One of the virtues of all this is the idea of a virtue smashes through that distinction that we discussed earlier between selfish actions on the one hand, or self-interested actions, and doing what you ought to do, doing the right thing on the other. Because if you have a virtue, say honesty, what Aristotle would say is that is exemplified by the fact that you, if you're honest, perform it quite naturally and gladly. In fact, the test of having a virtue is that you enjoy doing it. So instead of just going down on selfishness and saying selfishness is bad, Nietzsche comes back with a question which basically goes, It's not a question of egoism. It's a question of whose ego? What virtues does it manifest? And with regard to love, which we talked about several lectures ago, the question is not just, is it love? But the question is, whose love? Is this a love which enhances excellence? Or is it a love which is simply basic security? We'll come back to this again.